Welcome, Barbara Adams.
Well, thank you so much, Nan. It's great of you to do these broadcasts. I've listened to a few of them, and I am honored to be part of this group. And I think you're doing such a great job with this initiative. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Now, you're a fellow with the Academy, which means that you have forged public policy and you forged the direction of housing and communities. You've done that in several ways. One seems to be in the finance and lending area, and another is in the legal area. Some of your work directly with the Housing Authority. So let's talk a little bit about your roles. Tell me a little bit more.
Well, absolutely. I'm happy to do that. Actually, I'm less of a policymaker, if I can mention that. Most of my role has been outside of Washington, D.C. I've been a transactional person. I've not been a policymaker to much of an extent. I've been more of an implementer. And I would say my housing background is a good example of where a transactional practice in affordable housing and community development can take a person. As you mentioned, I started as a summer associate at Duane Morris. This was in 1977. And summer associates at large law firms are not given highly critical, time-sensitive things to do because no one really knows for quite some time how they're going to do. And of course, they're inexperienced in practicing law at that phase of their careers. At the time I was a summer associate, I was actually a banker with a bank in northeastern Pennsylvania. And I had written myself out of the business plan so that I could spend the summer in Philadelphia doing this summer internship with the law firm. The bank I was with had an initiative to build senior Section 8 elderly housing near its branches in third-class cities, basically in northeastern Pennsylvania. The bank successfully ground leased a parcel next to a branch near Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And on that ground lease parcel, the developer built a Section 8 elderly project. The business model was that the elderly persons who were near, or in this case, right next to the bank branch, would have their Social Security deposits and other deposits deposited in the most convenient bank branch, which created a source of deposits for the bank. And this worked out very well as a beginning project. So the bank, and particularly me, as part of my job at that bank, was supposed to be looking at the footprint of our other branches to see where we could similarly work to co-locate more Section 8 elderly housing. Lots of these cities were downtowns where there customarily was an old hotel that was no longer financially viable because there are a lot of senior citizens and a lot of diminished growth in those areas. So hotels were no longer, the old hotels were no longer viable. And they were very good candidates for substantial rehabilitation into senior citizen housing, and to the extent our branches were located nearby, that was great. So when I got to Duane Morris, one of the projects that is, on the bottom of the pile for some lawyer at Duane Morris was an option on a piece of property. The property was in Chester County, and at that time, the main line of Philadelphia, which included Chester County and several other suburban counties, was suffering from a moratorium on the awarding of community development block grant funds because there were no Section 8 units in any of those counties. Now remember, this is 1977. So what a group that I called the Five Nice Guys from Berwyn, a town in Chester County, they wanted to develop Section 8 elderly housing, but they'd only gotten as far as an option on a piece of ground. When I got the file, I could see that they kept extending the option because I think because they actually knew how to do some kinds of real estate development, but not really subsidized housing, which is a highly specialized set of steps. When I got the file, probably my actual project was to extend this option on the ground. But I could see that the five nice guys from Berwyn, as I dubbed them, weren't making much progress very quickly. And knowing about the Section 8 developer my bank had worked with, I said, you need to work with a developer that knows how to put these kinds of transactions together. And I know one. And I made the introductions. And about 15 months later, the closing of Trinity House occurred through the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency with a long-term Section 8 elderly contract for new construction, thereby breaking the logjam for the community development block grant funding, at least for Chester County. Of course, the developer was happy with me, so was the law firm. I never left the law firm for the ensuing 28 years. Trinity House, which was that project, was followed in the next year or 18 months by Ardmore Senior Housing, smaller but similar, which was in Montgomery County, also a suburban county of Philadelphia. So that broke the logjam on CDBG funds for that county as well. That started me off at Duane Morris, and I went on while at the firm for the ensuing 28 years to build the affordable housing and community development practice at the firm. And this practice became a cornerstone of the firm's finance practice, which I led at the time I left the firm in 2005. As a transactional attorney in affordable housing and community development, I and our firm, other attorneys with me at the firm, handled all kinds of tax-driven, usually subsidized real estate investments. So I represented for-profit and nonprofit developers and owners, so therefore I handled real estate, construction, and development matters. I represented bond underwriters and bond trustees, therefore handling capital markets transactions. And I represented some housing authorities, the Delaware State Housing Authority and Philadelphia Housing Authority, as a partner at Duane Morris. So that did expose me to some policy matters. Tracing the kinds of deals we did from 1977 to 2005, in the late 70s and early 80s, the transactions elicited investment by investors because of accelerated depreciation tax benefits. We also did some 202s, which were less tax-driven other than the nonprofits that sponsored them. We did 11Bs. We went on to FHA-insured tax-exempt bond issues. We dealt with shorter and shorter Section 8 contracts to back the financings. And then beginning in 1986, until I left the firm in 2005, there were, the tax credit was enacted, and we did substantially all 9% and 4% tax credit transactions. Along the way, I also handled my fair share of single family mortgage revenue bonds, which is a different aspect of the affordable housing business, the home ownership aspect. Since I left the firm in 2005, the practice continues, and it's expanded into new markets tax credits and more recently opportunity zones. Also, when I was at the firm, the practice was largely located in the mid-Atlantic part of the United States. Since the firm has expanded its footprint throughout the country, transactions are now done all over the country. But in addition to working as a transactional attorney, I also had the occasion to be on 3 housing transition teams of newly elected officials. When Mayor-elect Ed Rendell became the mayor-elect, which was in 1991, I was on his housing transition team. And then when that same Ed Rendell became governor-elect in 2002, I co-chaired that transition team. And later, Our current governor, Governor Wolf, when he was elected governor in 2014, I was also on his transition team. In 2005, when I left Duane Morris, as you pointed out in your introduction, I became the general counsel of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. That's largely a legal management job because the Office of General Counsel consists of over 500 attorneys representing 32 executive agencies of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So I wasn't really doing transactions anymore, but my agencies did include the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency and the Department of Community and Economic Development. So I was still somewhat part of the affordable housing world. In addition, the housing transition team, which I had co-chaired, one of our recommendations was that the governor set up a governor's office of housing and community development in order to integrate the housing functions, which were spread throughout different agencies. Largely, housing policy was handled by PHFA, the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency, and the Department of Community and Economic Development, but there were little pockets of housing policy in other places. So the governor did set up the governor's office of housing and community development, and I worked with the head of that department throughout my time as general counsel at the Commonwealth. At the end of the governor's term, as you mentioned, I became the general counsel of the Philadelphia Housing Authority, essentially appointed by HUD because the Housing Authority was then in receivership. The Housing Authority was in receivership not because of financial distress, but because of management irregularities. One of them being that the Office of Legal Counsel was virtually non-existent. So I had to rebuild that office. And then I went on to structure the settlement between HUD and the Philadelphia Housing Authority in order that the Housing Authority would be able to exit from the receivership. As you also mentioned in your intro, I now serve on various corporate boards and civic boards. One of the boards is the Philadelphia Energy Authority, and I've served on that authority since it was founded. The Energy Authority is not about pipelines and fracking and coal plants. Rather, we use energy as a tool for social justice. We're creating 21st century jobs in the energy sector, especially in solar. We're lowering the utility financial burden of households, thereby alleviating poverty. And we're improving public health by improving the energy infrastructure of homes using solar, weatherproofing, energy efficient HVAC, and water improvements. We do have some funding for low and moderate income persons in order to enable them to access these benefits. Our signature issue is the energy campaign, where we are leveraging, we hope, $1 billion in public and private financing to invest in clean energy and energy efficiency projects, which are in 4 sectors. One, in affordable housing. The second sector is small business. The third sector is public schools. And the fourth sector is city government. Our goals are to create jobs, strengthen communities, cut energy bills, and reduce Philadelphia's carbon footprint. So that's my journey.
And that's quite a journey. Let's go back to the senior housing. We haven't really had a whole lot of production going in senior housing for a long time. Do you think that we're going to eventually reach a crisis in this because we continue to have the aging population without the housing available, or is there enough turnover to suffice?
Well, I think there is a crisis possibly for at least 2 reasons. Shortage of supply and an escalating demand is clearly one component of that. But the other thing to know is that when seniors went into senior housing developments that were created in the 70s and 80s, they were 55 plus. They're a lot older today. And as the elderly have become, let me say, the older elderly, they have a whole new set of needs. Certainly they want to age in place because the alternatives for low-income persons are not attractive. So there is a bias clearly towards remaining in one's apartment. This has created a number of challenges for owners and managers of elderly housing developments. 202s with nonprofit sponsors are a little better positioned to handle this, but for-profit developers and managers have had to cobble together what local programs they can find from local nonprofits who want to provide these services, and from government where they can access some kind of funding for these services. But that's a big challenge. As you know, it's not just a challenge though. For senior housing, there's a big challenge on creating enough multifamily housing for the low-income populations who need that product.
Yeah, and I think we tend to talk more about that population and the needs for, instead of the seniors, the needs for more the family housing. But, you know, the senior, as you said, the seniors are trying to stay in their unit longer because they don't want to go to a nursing home.
Right.
And of course, that's been true for a long time. Are you seeing that eventually there's just going to be a lot of evictions, or it sounds like what you've heard is owners are trying to accommodate?
Yes, the housing properties that I'm aware of, owners are trying to accommodate. Well, in our area, there's something called Surrey Services for Seniors, and I'm sure in other areas there are people in the nonprofit sector who cater to trying to make the lives of seniors better, both socially as well as checking up services to make sure everybody's alive and as well as can be expected at that point in time. There are some owners who have put in emergency alarm buttons so someone in distress can notify the concierge or the owner or some service provider who can be responsive to that kind of emergency.
It just wasn't their original design. You know, they're not really prepared to do that, except, as you say, trying to cobble together some outside services. So just made me think, boy, I wonder if that's going to be more of a crisis soon than it has been in the past.
Yes, it is a crisis. It's a crisis in Philadelphia in a different way, not quite directly related to affordable housing developments, but a great deal of the housing stock in Philadelphia, which has the largest poverty rate of any large city in America, Philadelphia does, unfortunately, but a lot of the housing stock is owned by seniors who have inherited the property, have almost no resources to make it convenient for seniors to live in. In other words, these are multi-story townhouse type units. They don't have access to sufficient cash to maintain the properties properly. So there's a significant amount of property and therefore neighborhood deterioration that arises out of that. So this is the fact that there's an insufficient amount of senior housing that's designed to address the needs of seniors can be seen immediately in cities like Philadelphia, where the consequences, people remain housed in inappropriate housing that they cannot maintain.
And especially for low income elderly, because, you know, the upper income elderly do have more and more choices with assisted housing and then progressing into nursing homes, et cetera, even on the same property. But low income elderly don't have some of those same options.
Absolutely correct.
So what do you feel in looking back? And you've done a lot of different things. What do you feel is your biggest success story?
I think I have to say the creation and the continued existence of the affordable housing and community development practice at Duane Morris is probably my biggest success story as a transactional lawyer in the affordable housing and community development field. And certainly that reflects the foundation of that practice were the dozens of projects that I was involved in creating as the lawyer. I mean, the developers and the contractors actually created it, but as the lawyer, it's very rewarding to see actual buildings and know that a lot of people have homes, partly as a result of my efforts. So that's the major legacy item I think I have. I'm also very proud of having crafted the settlement between HUD and PHA, because it was a kind of throw your hands up and how do we get out of this by both parties, I think. So I was fortunate to have kind of a, okay, we'll put together an agreement perspective, which is what finally happened. And when all the parties got comfortable with that, HUD was able to allow the agency to return to local control. And then,
go ahead.
well, I was going to say one other thing, because it actually reflects something that I am very pleased about, and I think needs more of in the affordable housing area. But I represented People's Emergency Center in Philadelphia, and People's Emergency Center at the end of the 80s was a homeless shelter provider, but they had a very dynamic executive director, and she wanted to do more. She wanted to create a continuum of care. So she identified a 3-story building, and her vision was to create a classic homeless shelter that, well, everything, you know, transition in and out every day for, it was supposed to be for homeless women and children. The second floor was to be transitional housing. And the third floor, she wanted to create 9 units of permanent subsidized low-income rental housing. And of course, because all these things were co-located, there was, by default, appropriate social services for everyone, because the first 2 phases were all about social services. But to get to the third floor, you had to confront the first 2. Well, in order to do this, I think it came out of the tax credit rules at the time, which were quite new. So no one wanted to do anything too exotic about the nature of the ownership interest. So for some reason, condo didn't work. And our real estate attorneys solved this problem by creating separate estates. So the third floor, where this tax credit housing was to be, became a separate estate. Well, in Philadelphia at that time, the only other place that had been used as a real estate technique was in a large skyscraper building, which could much more easily afford all of the documentation and work that is involved in creating separate estates within a single building. So we had a lot of challenging times with the recorder of deeds as a result of all of this, but at the end of the day, it worked. And the People's Emergency Center successfully operated as a homeless services provider, went on to do a large multifamily subsidized housing development, and even has a homeownership product in its neighborhood for formerly homeless people.
What's the difference between an estate and a condo?
Well, one important difference is there's no homeowners association and no draining of the revenue from the rental tax credit property to go into an entity for maintaining common elements. And what we had to do was create an elaborate set of covenants that each estate, you know, the transitional housing and the homeless intake portions were going to pay for some kinds of expenses, and the low-income housing tax credit units on the third floor would pay for others, and combined together was the whole of all that needed to be addressed. But there was no need for a separate entity which would be a revenue user. So that was one main difference. There was a lot of technical real estate issues that there may be other matters, but I believe that was the major issue. The other issue I know, though, was This was at the end of the 80s, so the tax credit started in 1986, and people were very conservative back at the end of the 80s about what all of this meant. So no one wanted to do anything that was further away from a separate, what we call fee simple title. So the estate seemed closer to fee simple title than some kind of condo interest.
You have faced a lot of challenges. I'm just wondering whether supervising 500 attorneys would be a challenge.
Yeah, it was a very interesting position to be in, and I thought my background at the time to be quite narrow for such a position, because a lot of what 500 lawyers do is litigation, which I didn't have any background in. And a lot of what government does is investigations and subpoenas, and I didn't have any background in that either. And there are an endless parade of employment law matters that come up because someone is disgruntled about this, that, or the next thing, when you have a workforce of 80,000, which is what the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has. And I had no background in that either. But what I did have was the experience at Duane Morris, which was also over 500 lawyers. Now, nobody was letting me run Duane Morris, but I was on the partners board, and I could see how we did it. And actually, Duane Morris had a rather well-known management focus, so well-known that it became a Harvard Business School case study, how Duane Morris was managing. And I was part of that administration at Duane Morris as a member of the Partners Board. So I had seen a lot of what you do when you have to manage a lot of lawyers. And the chairman of our law firm at the time, Sheldon Bonowitz, was the one who ended up being part of the Harvard Business School case study. And many times at the Commonwealth, I would think, when confronted with some dilemma, how would Sheldon Bonowitz deal with this? And, it was very helpful.
Let's talk a little bit about your energy campaign. How are you getting the word out?
Well, first of all, we have a website. Secondly, we have a lot of support from Philadelphia's City Council, and some, not quite as much support as the City Council. We have some support from the mayor's office. Under our previous mayor, Philadelphia really showcased as much as it could sustainability efforts. There was a lot of work by the prior city administration in green works and trying to reduce Philadelphia's carbon footprint. So there was a certain amount of interest governmentally in those kinds of initiatives. And there are lots of publications and events and websites for that, which is different from the Energy Authority. But when the Energy Authority was created to look more into energy specifically, we had the benefit of those stakeholders and constituencies interested in sustainability to start with. And then I have to say, our staff has really stepped up. As one of my fellow board members says all the time, we are always punching above our weight. Because initially we were given no budget by the City Council that so championed us, and no budget by the city, which was less of a champion. But the initial board consisted of 2 lawyers, 2 engineers, and 1 community activist. And for the first few years, we just did it ourselves. I mean, 2 lawyers can get the authority organized and make sure it's sunshined when it meets and all kinds of technical rules about municipal authorities, and 2 engineers started providing what the city and in some of the city's projects found to be very useful technical input. And our advocate became the executive director of the Energy Authority, and really the credit for the energy campaign goes to her. She conceived of it. She drafted how it would work. She used recognized metrics in order to be able to predict with some reliability the amount of investment that could be envisioned over the 10-year period it covers and the amount of employment that would result. And she's the one who has actually taken the authority in the direction of providing services which are social justice oriented in nature, as opposed to getting into the fray of who should own the Philadelphia gas works and what should we do with a large refinery issue that's down on the waterfront, and whether or not fracking pipelines should go through eastern Pennsylvania. That's not what we do. We're trying to relieve poverty in Philadelphia using energy as a tool.
You know, that's a topic that a lot of younger people are very interested in, and a cause that I know they would like to further. Many of them would like to further. What would you say to a younger person who feels that way?
About energy specifically?
Yeah, getting into it, and what do you see the benefits are, and what do you think they could do, and things like that.
I think energy is a field somewhat like housing, I have to say, but it's a field that has a lot of new possibilities. That housing maybe a little less new, a little less cutting edge regarding sustainability and climate change and interest by younger people. We at the Energy Authority have no trouble at all getting interns to work with us. This is maybe not so good, but we have highly qualified people who do not make huge salaries, but who simply want to be in this field. You get exposed to communities, and you can help, you can see the improvements that are made in communities, individual homes where people put on solar panels and start to generate income for themselves by being able to sell energy back into the grid, as well as eliminating most of their electrical bill. So that's exciting. You get exposed to finance situations, which can, move a young person in the direction of investment banking. There's a lot of public policy. There's a lot of engineering if you want to get into that part of it. So I think it's a very exciting field for young people because you can go at it from many different interest points of view. And I think that's very similar, frankly, to affordable housing. There are so many aspects of affordable housing. You can be a developer, you can be in construction, you can be in the planning department, the government, investment banking, you can be a lawyer, as I was. So there are a lot of entry points to that industry, which can provide careers for people with all kinds of different interests.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing everything with us today, Barbara, because I think, you've had a breadth of interest and a breadth of impact on a variety of areas. Even though you were a transactional type attorney, you've really gone far beyond that in your impact of what has happened. And we really, appreciate hearing that. Do you have anything else that you would like to say to the listeners or leave them with?
Maybe just this. One of your podcasts, the one with Bob Moss, included the startling comment, which I think you mentioned in yet another podcast. I haven't listened to them all, but I've listened to several, that there could be a time in the near future when a quality housing unit might be able to be produced for $10,000. That's a big disruptor. talk about the need for senior housing, multifamily housing. A low-cost housing option is really what we need in order to meet the demand that's out there. I have to say, after I heard that, I thought to myself, consider what will happen to the value of existing housing. So that's a big disruptor. So I thought I'd just make mention of that, since I think that would be a great solution to availability of affordable housing.
And Bob was talking about 3D printing.
I know.
He mentioned that. And subsequently, I saw an article talking about 50 units or houses being built in Mexico as one of the starts of the project on 3D printers. So I agree with you. I think we better watch that and see what's going on with it. We still would have the zoning laws. We still would have the local barriers, but maybe it's the answer or a part of the answer.
Or at least for some components until we start doing entire homes.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating phenomenon to watch.
It really is. Well, thank you so much for participating.
Well, thank you, Nan. It's been a pleasure.